Steve?
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to start off with kind of an overview, a sort of general discussion of the issue of immigration and crime. And then basically the rest of the panel will be more focused, more nuts and bolts, or more grounded in what goes on in communities and that sort of thing. Now, as I'm sure you're mostly aware, excluding those who have committed crimes from the United States has long been a goal of policymakers and the public. A significant share of the public seems to believe, based on some polls, that immigrants do commit a disproportionate share of crime. On the other hand, there are a very large number of opinion writers and journalists and advocacy groups have argued just as strongly, or even stronger, that immigrant crime rates are very low. So if you were to search the internet, you'd certainly find a lot of diversity of opinion. Now, one of the reports, as Mark said, that we are releasing today explores this question of immigrant crime or criminality in great detail. You have a copy of it in your packet. It's authored by myself and Jessica Vaughn to my left. One of the main findings is that the lack of good representative data and, quite frankly, contrary information makes it very difficult to come to a clear conclusion on this question. The bottom line is anyone who asserts that the issue is settled is either cherry-picking their evidence or is simply uninformed about the latest data. Now, in my comments, I'll try to focus on three main things as quickly as I can. First, I'll just touch on why it's so difficult to study this issue. What are some of the problems? I can't go through all of them. There are that many. Second, what did the older research on this question of immigrant crime and criminality tell us? And what are some of the problems with that older research? And then third, I will discuss the newest government estimates and data, and then some of the problems with those newer estimates and data. Now, the biggest problem when studying immigrant crime is a lack of good representative data. With the exception of the federal prison system, which mainly really only tracks citizen, non-citizen, not foreign-born versus native-born, but with the exception of the federal prison system, which accounts for only a small fraction of all those incarcerated, the vast majority of states and local correctional institutions typically have not tried to carefully determine whether a person in their facility is, in fact, native or foreign-born. If they do try, and more have been trying lately, they typically use self-reporting. That is, they ask the person as their primary way of identifying whether someone is foreign-born or not. Because being a non-citizen can lead to deportation, there is in this setting a very obvious incentive for individuals to try and lie about whether they were born outside of the United States, particularly if they're here illegally. Now, you can try to check immigration databases, and more that's been done, and we're going to talk about those issues, I think, a lot today. But even checking against immigration records doesn't always answer your question because it must be remembered there is no definitive list of legal residents and U.S. citizens that you could just check against to find out. And, of course, there is no such list of illegal aliens. If an illegal immigrant has not had prior contact with an immigration official, their fingerprints and other information, for example, will not be in any government database. There is even less good data on those arrested. At least when it comes to incarceration, we sometimes can get a picture, incomplete though it may be and imperfect though it may be. But when it comes to things like arrests and those charged with crimes, quite frankly, the data is even more incomplete. And finally, I should point out, and this is clearly the case, even when there is good data, it may not be made public in a way that allows for systematic analysis by researchers. Now, let me talk a little bit about some of the problems with prior research. Two recent and widely cited studies have tried to shed light on this question of immigrant crime by looking at data from the 2000 census on people in institutions. The census divides the population. One of the things you can look at is people in institutions, and if you look at young men in institutions, you can get a pretty good idea, hopefully, of the prison populations. The two studies that did this was one by the Public Policy Institute of California entitled Crime, Corrections, and California, What Does Immigration Have to Do with It? The other is entitled The Myth of Immigrant Criminality and the Paradox of Assimilation, and was sponsored by the Immigration Policy Institute, a think tank created by the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Now, both studies conclude immigrant crime is low, and both studies suffer from a fundamental data problem. And that data problem is this. Although it is well known within the Census Bureau that the citizenship and country of birth data for persons and institutions from the 2000 census is of very poor quality, both the Census, in fact, both the Census Bureau and National Research Council have looked at this question. That fact is not well known outside of the Bureau. The National Research Council, in its look at the institutionalized population, found that 53% of the time when they were looking at someone in an institution who was a prisoner, they had to make a guess as to whether that person was immigrant or native. Now, in the report, I have a long discussion of how they make those educated guesses. There are lots of issues with those guesses. But the point is, most of the time they just didn't know and had to allocate or impute whether the person was immigrant. So that if you run an analysis of institutionalized data in the census, you're essentially measuring their guesses, not the actual institutionalization of immigrants or natives. And this is important because these two studies are important, but also a number of other earlier research had tried to do the same thing, to get around these data problems, look at institutionalized people. The problem is actually even maybe greater than I've given you some indication, because of the 47% who they didn't allocate or impute, the vast majority of them they never interviewed either, maybe 1/10. They just looked at administrative record and tried to figure out whether the person was foreign born. Now, this problem of not being able to determine whether someone's foreign born or immigrant mainly just applies in the census to the institutionalized data. The general data is pretty good from the census, but not for people in institutions. One way we can really see how poor this data is just to look at the results. This data shows a 28% decline in the number of incarcerated immigrants 1990 to 2000, yet the overall immigrant population grew in America by 59%. So you have this very significant decline if you look at the census data for institutions, but the overall census data shows a massive decline. A massive increase, I should say. Newer census data from 2007 shows something even more funny. It shows a 146% increase in the number of incarcerated immigrants in the census data. Yet the overall immigrant population, 2000 to 2007, grew only 22%. These wild and implausible swings are a clear illustration of why you can't use this data for this kind of research. Either that, or we are in the midst of a massive increase in immigrant incarceration of 146% in just 7 years, and I don't think that's the case. It's just an underlying problem with the data. Now, in our conversations with people at the Census Bureau, they do feel that the 2000 data is much better. They didn't have to impute as much. It hasn't been analyzed as much as the 2000 census. But nonetheless, what that means is as the data got better, the foreign-born population grew dramatically, which means that in 2000, when they allocated or imputed or made those educated guesses, they were clearly biased towards assigning people who are actually foreign-born. They made them native-born.